il est temps maintenant de s'interroger sur les solutions, s'interroger sur les compétences, s'interroger sur les qualités qui nous restent à développer pour nous permettre de mieux nous préparer aux crises qui viennent. Alors pour vous parler d'une de ces qualités, j'ai le plaisir d'accueillir Kaila Colbin, qui est mon associée néo-zélandaise dans l'aventure Boma. Elle a été formée au leadership par notamment la sociologue Brené Brown, dont vous avez peut-être découvert le travail dans un documentaire Netflix. Elle a travaillé avec elle sur la notion de courage. Bonjour Kaila, est-ce que tu es là?
Bonjour Michel.
Bonjour. Don't worry, we are going to switch in English, but I know that you speak perfectly French, donc j'en profitais pour échanger quelques mots avec toi en français.
Not so perfect, but good enough to appreciate the speakers who came before me. That was a wonderful talk from Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Kaila, and thank you for Elizabeth. Kaila, can you tell us what is courage?
For me, the best way to describe courage is that it's a muscle. It's a muscle that we need to work at and that we can develop. And what the research shows us is that courage, a couple of things that are super important. Number one, that muscle comprises 4 skill sets that are teachable, that are measurable, that are observable. Often we have this idea about courage that it's something that we're either born with or we're not. You either have it or you don't. You can't really pin it down. You just some people just are courageous. And that is not true at all. Courage, in fact, comprises very specific skill sets that we can teach and that we can exercise and that we can learn. The other critical thing to understand about courage is that our single most accurate measure of courage is our willingness to lean into vulnerability. And when we talk about vulnerability, it's worth getting really clear on the definition. What we're talking about, vulnerability, is risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. Risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And so I want to invite you and anyone listening, your wide audience in pour toute la France and in the world, to do a little experiment with me. And the experiment is, I want you to bring to mind a time when you saw someone doing something courageous. It can be somebody you know, somebody you don't know, somebody famous, somebody close to you. It can be something recent, something from a long time ago. Bring that moment to mind. And I want you to ask yourself, what role did vulnerability play in that moment? Was that person taking a risk? Were they facing uncertainty? Were they opening themselves up to emotional exposure? You cannot have courage without vulnerability, because without risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure, the thing you're doing doesn't require courage at all. It's just easy. So leaning into vulnerability is our single most accurate measure of courage. And it's something that anyone can practice and cultivate and become better at over time.
And in a situation of crisis, why is courage important for dealing with what we can leave?
Yeah, I mean, a crisis is where I think it would be absolutely impossible to respond effectively without courage. A crisis, by definition, is chock full of risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. That's what a crisis is. It's a moment when we have no clear answers, when we don't know what the future holds. And what our natural human tendency is in situations like that is to run and hide, to protect ourselves. One of the interesting things that the research tells us about courage is that we often think that the biggest barrier to courage is fear. We think the thing that stops us from being courageous is that we're afraid. But in fact, what the research shows is that fear is not at all what stands between us and courage. The thing that prevents us from being courageous is not fear, but armor, how we protect ourselves when we feel vulnerable, when we feel risk, when we feel uncertainty, when we feel emotional exposure. So in times of crisis, when there are no certain answers, our natural human tendency is to try to seek certainty, to try to seek answers. It's to try to protect ourselves from risk, to protect ourselves from danger, to not put ourselves on the line, to not open ourselves up to the potential of being wrong. And what we're seeing with the pandemic that's rampaging throughout the world is that we have leaders who are responding to it from a place of being clear about what they do and what know and what they don't know, about what they do have control over and what they don't have control over. And on the other hand, we have leaders who are trying to protect themselves, to avoid looking at the uncertainty of the situation. And it's very clear from the data which of those leadership styles is more effective in responding to the pandemic. The more willing a leader is to embrace the uncertainty of the crisis, to take decisive action, but decisive action in the context of clarity about what they know and what they don't know and what they do and don't have control over, the more effective that leader is going to be in being able to respond to the crisis. And we see that over and over again throughout the world.
I have a question from Eric Daré in the chat, who's asking, do we need a dose of recklessness, of unconsciousness to be courageous? And that leads to the question I wanted to ask you. What are the biggest myths about vulnerability?
Yeah, that's a great question about recklessness and unconsciousness. I'm going to say yes to the first and no to the second. And here's what I mean by that. When we are going, so let's take, for example, often when we think about courage, we think about huge things. I don't know what examples you came up with when you were doing that exercise, but usually when I ask people to think of a courageous moment, they think of, someone rescuing someone from a burning building, or, leading a march to save something, or, something very grand. But actually, courage is something that we all are called upon to display in a million small ways every day. Like, asking for a pay rise is an act of courage. Having a difficult conversation with our spouse, with our husband or wife, is an act of courage. And so, asking someone on a date is an act of courage. Anytime that we're opened up to rejection, that is an act of courage. And so, what happens is, in order for us to be courageous, we have to have an element of recklessness. And what I mean by that is we have to be willing to do the courageous thing without any guarantee of what the response is going to be. That is what we mean by risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. If I'm raising something, if I'm asking you for a date, let's say I'm asking you for a date, that's an act of courage. And the reason it's an act of courage is because you might say no, and I might get hurt by that, right? So I have to have that element of recklessness. The reason that I said no to the unconsciousness is because all of the skill sets of courage, which include not only leading into vulnerability, but also understanding deeply the elements of trust, how we live into our values, how we bounce back after those setbacks, if our moment of courage doesn't go as we'd hoped. What all of those skill sets of courage tell us is that in order to be truly courageous leaders and truly courageous people, we have to be more present in the moment rather than less. And so potentially by unconsciousness, you might have meant not letting our thinking brain get in the way of what we're doing. And if that's the case, then I would agree. But if by unconsciousness you meant a lack of presence, then what I would say is courage requires us to be present in this moment, to be attentive to our own tendency to protect ourselves, to our own tendency to armor up, and to be conscious about how we take off that armor and leave it aside as we enter into the courageous moment.
Kaila, can you tell us about the Stockdale Paradox?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. I would love to tell you about the Stockdale Paradox. So the Stockdale Paradox for me is the best story about how the kind of courage that we need in a crisis. And it comes from a man called Admiral Jim Stockdale. He was in the US military during the Vietnam War. He was a pilot, and his plane was shot down over Vietnam during the war. He was taken captive and became a prisoner of war. He spent 7.5 years in the infamous Hanoi Hilton prison camp. And he underwent horrific torture. He had to do horrific things in order to survive. And when he came out, afterwards, they asked him, what was it that allowed you to make it through when so many others didn't? And more specifically, like what was the difference between the people who survived and the people who didn't? And did the people who didn't make it, what did those people have in common? And he said, oh, that's easy. The ones who didn't make it, those were the optimists. Those were the ones who said, oh, we'll be home by Christmas. And Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And they'd say, we'll be home by Easter. And Easter would come and Easter would go. And they'd say, we'd be home by Thanksgiving, by November. And Thanksgiving would come and go. And he said it would be Christmas again, and they would die of a broken heart. He said the ones who made it through were the ones who never confused total faith that they would prevail in the end, which is something you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, no matter how difficult they may be. Total faith that we will prevail, with the discipline to confront the brutal facts of the present moment. Brene Brown calls this gritty faith and gritty facts. And this became known elsewhere as the Stockdale Paradox. For me, it's not a paradox at all. And the reason it's not a paradox at all is because those two things are, one of them is causative of the other. The only way that we will be able to prevail in a crisis is if we have the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of our current reality. The only way we will be able to overcome the challenges that we're facing is if we are truly dealing with the challenges as they are, not wishing they weren't, not wishing things were different, not hoping they'd go away, not closing our eyes to how challenging everything is, not trying to run, not trying to protect ourselves, not trying to hide. The only way we can overcome is by having the discipline to confront those brutal facts. And during the coronavirus, I've come back to Stockdale again and again, and I see it again. I see it in our political leaders here in New Zealand. We've had very effective leadership throughout the crisis. And I've seen our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, get up and present to the nation and talk about the very harsh reality that we're facing, the very grave risks that we're open to right now, and the necessity of taking the very extreme measures that we've taken. And then I've, in the same session, seen her get asked a question by a journalist, "Are you scared?" And to hear her respond, "No, because we have a plan." Total faith that we would prevail, total discipline to confront the brutal facts of our current reality.
I would like to share with you two comments and questions coming from the audience. Valerie saying uncertainty is becoming one of the most important components of our society today. And of course, you think that courage is a very important skill to develop in our society. And the second question is coming from Isabel. She's just saying that, in fact, having courage is confronting to reality. Isn't it more than that?
Is having courage, are you saying is having courage more than facing reality?
Yeah. Is it having courage, is it only being able to confront and facing reality as it is, or is it more than that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and we could get very philosophical on this and stay here until all hours of the morning. It's late at night my time. So, yeah, we need some wine for this. We need a few Gauloises. So where this becomes philosophical is that. Where courage starts is in facing the reality of ourselves. And that's a reality that's very subjective and often hard to pin down. But where courage becomes important is for the things that we ourselves are struggling with, right? Not the things that we find easy, the things that we find difficult, the moments where our stomachs hurt and we don't want to do the thing that we're about to do, and every fiber of our being is saying, run as fast as you can, don't do this. That is the moment that calls for us to be courageous. So there's an element about facing reality when it's phrased that way that sounds to me like we're talking about an external reality. But really, where courage is the most necessary and critical skill set is the courage to deal with ourselves as we truly are. Last year, when we could still do physical events, I spoke at an event alongside General Stanley McChrystal. General McChrystal, he's a 4-star general who was the chair of Joint Special Operations Command in the U.S. And he's known as a sort of leadership legend. And I had to speak after him. And he spoke for an hour on leadership, and the MC got up and said, we're about to hear from Kaila about courage, but obviously, General, when you're talking about courage, it's at a whole nother level. And he said, I'll tell you what. It is far easier to be brave on the battlefield than it is to be brave in the boardroom. He said he's known guys who've been on the front line 20, 30 years who wouldn't hesitate to pick up a weapon against an enemy because that's what they're trained to do, but whose voice would shake just as much as yours or mine if they had to say a hard truth to someone they respect. And so is courage just about facing reality externally? Sure. But it's also about opening ourselves up and being willing to look at those things that we're most reluctant to do, that scare us the most, that activate the deepest fears and anxieties and uncertainties and shames that we might have, and being willing to sit with those as they are. That's true courage.
I have a last question for you, Kaila. To be very pragmatic, and what could we do if we want to become more courageous? What people should try to do? Where should they begin to be courageous?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first place to begin is it's easy, and it's also a little bit unfortunate because we always hope that we can start with, oh, maybe someone else can help me. But the place to begin, of course, is with ourselves. Who we are is how we lead. That's something that Brené says that I come back to over and over again. And this is a journey that is entirely personal for everyone who goes on it. When we start that journey with ourselves, one of the things to look at is, what are the areas that where we most want to protect ourselves? What are the areas where we feel least willing to take a risk? What are the areas where we feel most reluctant to say difficult things? I have 3 wonderful stepsons. They are 12, 10, and 6. And just recently, we had a situation where the 12-year-old and the 10-year-old got into a big fight about something. The 10-year-old had run into his room, slammed and locked the door. The 12-year-old standing outside the door. I'm standing with him, waiting for him to apologize to his brother. And he says, I don't want to do it. And I said, I know you don't. You still have to. And he said, my tummy hurts. And I said, I totally understand that. And I get that feeling too when I have to do something difficult. And that feeling to me, that tummy hurt feeling, is the absolute sign to me that the thing I'm doing is something I have to do. It's the courageous thing that I have to do. So where do we begin? By starting to look inside, by starting to understand ourselves and the things that we most want to run from. In Star Wars, Joseph Campbell said, the cave we fear to enter holds the treasure we seek. Star Wars, they use this metaphor all the time of Luke going into the cave and fighting Darth Vader and turning out that he's fighting himself, right? The only place we can begin is with ourselves. And of course, I learned so much by training with Brené Brown, so I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend her books.